Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to ultimately review Season 5, Episode 2 of The Masked Singer. Gotta frickin' see what my numbers going on there. We are here today to review this episode and otherwise define whether or not we are going to be good at guessing for the season. Reasonably, this episode came a little bit easier than the first episode did. The first episode, I had absolutely no clue. I was making up guesses, or I was going up with ultimately going and just saying, like, well, maybe my guess is just going to be the judge's guess because it's a lot easier. So, within this episode, I will let you know by mascotted name who had gotten home, or who had gone home, and ultimately we will unmask that by the end of this review. Ultimately, I will have to pause in between the last choice here because ultimately I had put together some other kind of package for another thing that I'm going to be doing at some point. Ultimately, the Justice League Snyder Cut, I had seen the first half of that, so I'm reviewing the first half of it. So that'll happen eventually. I'll review that as well. So we ultimately have the Black Swan that ultimately had gone first. The person who had gone home tonight, ultimately, or on this episode, ultimately was the Phoenix. I will let you know by the end of the episode who that was. But going back, so ultimately we had the Black Swan. Immediately, the clues kind of were of Disney descent. I was kind of watching this and I was like, yeah, I sounds like quite a few people when hearing this, when watching this and enjoying this Black Swan Ash-like person. Immediately, what came to mind when I ultimately had seen the number 5 was I justifiably have no clue what the heck is what that means. Supposedly there was number 5 in a clue package. Don't know. So ultimately, I ended up picking Vanessa Hudgens as Black Swan. I could be completely wrong about this. Sounded like her when kind of hearing the voice of the song artist. I could honestly probably say the American Idol Fantasia would probably also be a pick of mine for Black Swan. But ultimately, when Black Swan had talked, ultimately they had mentioned that doing this was out of their element. Hearing that, I would ultimately say that, like, well, you could say that Vanessa Hutchins hasn't done music in such a very long time. The last musical thing that she ended up doing was High School Musical, of course, but that was so long ago. So immediately I chose Vanessa Hutchinson because I just naturally assumed that, like, this is a person that they're out of their element because they haven't done singing in quite a long time. So that's where I kind of naturally assumed it might be Vanessa Hutchinson. If you guys are Vanessa Hutchins, if you have any better picks or you can guarantee that ultimately you know something about one of these masked individuals that I do not know, then go ahead and leave down in the comments below that you feel so strongly that such and such character is such and such person. Ultimately, help me out, especially on the very first episode review. Go and check that out as well to ultimately give me better suggestions of who you think could be any of those masked individuals, so I won't get any wrong within the next episodes to follow. So, let's move on. Ultimately, there is the grandpa like monster. So ultimately, supposedly the clue package had like a dumbbell of sorts, and ultimately it seems that this clue package was to reveal that it was a athlete of sorts. I could have honestly through the clue package, I also heard that seemingly this character was a former, maybe quite possibly former child star, or maybe former athlete of sorts. The first thing that came to mind was quite possibly a guy named Leo Rush, who is formerly a WWE Cruiserweight Champion and just seemingly former wrestler for the most point. Leo Rush ultimately is a cruiserweight like character, so he's kind of light on his feet. But also, while listening to an interview that he had done, he had mentioned aspirations about singing. So it could quite possibly be that this uh, grandpa individual could quite honestly be uh, Leo Rush. I've never heard him once sing, but here's the thing: it could quite possibly finally be a wrestler of sorts. Because ultimately, a lot of people were thinking that it could quite possibly be a wrestler. I think a lot of guesses were way off, way off for this one. I also thought of Jamel White. I hope I'm saying that right. It's Jaleel. Jamel White. Ultimately, formerly of being on Family Matters, of course, being Steve Urkel. That would be a fairly interesting pick. I've seen him sing on, I believe, Psych. So ultimately, he has sung before. Um, Other than that, there isn't much for me to otherwise tie Jamel's character to any of these clues. But ultimately, when looking at it, there are some times where some of the clues make zero diddly worth of sense. So when looking at it, it could be any number of people, it could be any number of things. Let me know in the comments below who you think that this character could be because of the clues. That it could quite possibly be very much an athlete of sorts. But other than that, let's move on. The Chameleon. Ultimately, I'd assumed that I had gone with really just Ken's guess of Dwight Jordan. Um, just because immediately, whenever Ken is churning and burning basically about an athlete, immediately I'm like, okay, well, Ken has to be right. So ultimately, if I do not get this correct, then I can easily blame Ken. But in the end, like I figured that this individual is fairly tall, and so it's like, okay, well, no matter what the clues say, like I think in a lot of ways it has to be some athlete of sorts. Um, but I'm really not quite familiar with picking an athlete. So immediately I was like, okay, whatever Ken's choice is probably correct. So in the end, again, uh, one judge pick, but ultimately at the end of the day, if you think that there is a much more cementing like celebrity, let me know in the comments below. Moving on. The Phoenix. I apologize how blurry this picture is. There was very few pictures. There was those available at the time of which that I had tried to do choices because ultimately, yeah, uh, scrambling while this show was going on to get photos was really hard. I naturally assumed via tone alone that this was Caitlyn Jenner. Like immediately I was like, you know what? Like I realized how fairly uh, in the news that she's been. I've realized how like I've seen quite a bit of her like throughout like news articles and stuff like that. So yeah, I ultimately had watched bits and pieces of keeping up with the Kardashians and stuff like that to ultimately see what the heck all the buzz was all about. And plus, also, I heard that that show was otherwise going to eventually dissolve and eventually go away, I guess. I didn't know much about any of the clues. There was a car clue, and I don't know anything much about any of that stuff. I just heard the tone of it because ultimately I've seen Caitlyn Jenner on TMZ talking about things, and so ultimately I've seen her in the news lately. So when looking at it, I just kind of really just heard the tone of the voice, and I just went by that. So reasonably, let's move on. The piglet, or the piglet, whatever bizarre names that they have to go with every one of these mascots. Reasonably, I immediately when I heard this, there was a commercial or some kind of little thing that ultimately had the piglet sing, and immediately I was like, that sounds like Nick Lachey from 98 Degrees. I don't know what any of the clues were, something about a heartbreak or something like that. If anything, there wasn't any clues about 98 Degrees, which ultimately I know he was in a band or a boy band called 98 Degrees. I ultimately know that he had done quite possibly some shows here and there that maybe not a lot of people know or care about. But reasonably, yeah, I naturally assumed it was Nick Lachey just by tone of voice. I didn't choose anybody else because I thought that it would have been a waste of time. But yeah, so those are all my choices for today's Masked Singer. Hopefully, any number of these characters are right. I feel much better about these choices for the most point. Um, Besides the first episode. So when we start to commingle a lot of these costume individuals, and the further along that we get in the show, maybe things will start to turn around, and we'll hopefully see. So ultimately, I am going to. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Uh, let's ultimately pause here so I can ultimately showcase who had gone home tonight, or who had gotten unmasked as the Phoenix on The Masked Singer, episode 2. All right, so Caitlyn Jenner was the Phoenix. Ultimately, by checking out Facebook, you can go ahead and see this. Ultimately, seeing her interview and stuff along those lines. Immediately, I was just kind of like, yeah, like, freaking the first episode got me. And ultimately, if you haven't seen that, I'm gonna say who that masked first individual was. Kermit the Frog was in the first episode, and now Caitlyn Jenner is in this second episode. Reasonably, yeah, I kind of feel good about ultimately just this episode overall, plus the bonus on top of it of just being able to pick Caitlyn Jenner. So immediately I'm like, yeah, like F that first episode. But the second episode we had evened 1-1, and like I was just kind of happy about being able to make that at least second attempt at ultimately trying to guess something correctly. So ultimately we have a lot of characters that I am not 100% sure at. So that's otherwise the scarcity or the otherwise just terrifyingness of going through every further episode to just be like, well, I'm very unsure. And they have made it a much more Herculean task to be able to figure out who people are within this season. Um, Especially with the whole first episode being Kermit the Frog, how you wouldn't naturally assess it would have been a Muppet, but now you can assess any number of things. So going into here, I immediately thought that ultimately Caitlyn Jenner Caitlyn Jenner for Jenner blah, blah, blah. Helps if I say it right. Caitlyn's performance was really fun. I think that ultimately a lot of people overall just really it was like kind of like okay, like I think reasonably within this episode there was a lot tougher competition in this episode than there was in the first. The first one, like you could have said, like, well, I don't know who exactly is going to be for the person that's going to get voted off. Wherein like this second episode, I was like, well, it's either the Chameleon or the Phoenix, and I was just kind of like going like, I don't know, like it could be either one, depending on especially how when people were guessing who people were, immediately it was just like, well, um, there are some people that like go, oh well, I like this person that ultimately the judges guess, so I'm going to try to keep them here, and so on and so forth. So it kind of is like a celebrity game of names, where ultimately you're just kind of guessing of who is to be the one that people are going to like in the room or pop culturally vote into saving for that week. So yeah, really, these first two episodes have really been fun to watch. I've really been enjoying them. But yeah, hopefully we're gonna keep this thing going. I don't have a normal, usual like recapping thing that I normally go into. I think this season I'm probably gonna go easier on that and not have to do a complete recap thing. So yeah. So at least it's 1-for-1 right now, and the show's still early. If anything, any number of people could have some interesting or better guesses than ultimately I have right now. But yeah, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.